Wonderful to be here. So yes, I thought I'd give my talk a question mark title, because I think people have a lot of questions about the digital world, and the very idea perhaps of thriving online raises lots of questions which pick up on some of what we've already been discussing today, and perhaps intensify some of the questions and doubts and worries that we have, but also the sense of possibility. So I'm a psychologist, a social psychologist, and I've been researching the ways in which families are engaging with digital media for some decades, from the days when new media meant time shifting on the VCR and the very first arrival of the home computer. And I've been kind of tracking how family life and the wider society have been changing with the kind of ever escalating pace of digital or technological innovation. And I guess in that last 30 years or so, you know, my talks oscillate. Sometimes I argue everything is changing because so much is changing, not always for the better. And sometimes I argue very many things are staying the same, and many things are staying the same about children, also not necessarily for the better. But one of the things that, you know, is so obvious to everyone when we think about children, and it's there in all my images, is the advent of the internet, which coincidentally is 30 years, or the World Wide Web, I should say, is also 30 years old today. Or, sorry, now, this year. So can children thrive online? What I want to argue in my time today is that the initial ideas that we had about how the internet or digital technologies could newly empower children and give them new kinds of opportunities are getting obscured. Those hopes and ambitions for children online are getting obscured by what has also been very evident to us now, which is a whole new set of risks of harm. And somehow I want to kind of end up with the idea that we might find a better balance than we are finding now, and that balance I want to frame like some of my colleagues before me in terms of children's rights, because I don't know why everything's happening this year, but the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child is also 30 today. So many things are happening. The technologies are developing. There's a greater focus on children's rights, and yet we seem to be very anxious about the digital and uncertain that it is really advancing children's rights. One of the things that the Convention on the Rights of the Child really emphasises is that we should listen to the child, to the voice of the child, to their experience and what's important to them. And one of the things I might say is the same over all those years that I've been researching children in relation to digital media is that we're still not listening to the child. We're still not really hearing the voice of the child in terms of what they want. I might say for their lives, but I'll leave that for others, but in relation to digital technologies. Whether we think children's lives are changing dramatically or in many ways fundamentally the same, I think what's clear is that because so much of what we do and so much of what children do in their everyday lives is now online, is now digitally encoded, the digital has become a kind of terrain. It's become a space where we are negotiating and navigating our values, our morals, our hopes, our fears, our practices, and the possibilities for children. So whether or not we say everything's changed or the same, the digital is a kind of a place in which we can really address the question of how children are thriving or not. So this is a kind of a dramatic but fair graph of how this is a graph for 0 to 4-year-old children in Britain. So even at the tiniest age, children are growing up with digital technology in their hands. And more importantly, I think, not only do they have the digital technology in their hands, but they're growing up in a world that is digital, in a world in which everyone else has the technology in their hands, and every process, every system, every institution that they engage with is operating through digital mechanisms. So children are really born into a digital world, and that digital world is, as we all know in our daily lives, complex, technologically demanding to manage sometimes, highly commercialized, quite difficult for governments to kind of manage and regulate because it's so global. And yet we all buy it, we all acquire it, we give it to our 0 to 4-year-olds, we want it in our homes, everyone's got it now in their pockets, I'm guessing. So there's an incredible kind of pull factor even as we worry. And all of those things that we've been thinking about in relation to the thriving child, all the things we want a child to do, to play, to learn, to socialize, to be creative, to express themselves, all of those things are now happening in a digital world and perhaps being reconfigured through the lens of the digital. So what are our expectations in this digital world? For the kind of past years in which digital technology has been arriving, we've often been asking questions about inequality, about who gets to climb the ladder of opportunities, if you like, and who doesn't. What are the processes of digital inclusion? How can we draw everybody in to this digital world? And the questions of inequalities are very serious and very real. And any research, I just give you a ladder, but not, as it were, the findings, but any research which shows who gets to do some of the kind of more exciting and demanding and challenging and valuable things online, all of that research shows inequalities on every dimension that you could imagine. But I think we're at a kind of tipping point in our public discourse because we're not quite so enthusiastic anymore to say, let's all climb that ladder of digital opportunities. Let's all get up and make sure that everyone is online and everyone is part of it. We're beginning to ask that question as a society, but why do we want to climb it? What is at the top? What are those benefits? What are we really hoping for when we encourage every child from birth onwards to get online and get engaged? And we're beginning to hear more and more talk about digital detox, about resistance, about putting it down, about leaving it alone. I think in terms of our time, we're beginning to have a useful discussion about what's a good balance. But what I really want to argue is that in terms of the opportunities and our aspirations for the thriving child online, we're still a long way from a kind of mature and thoughtful discussion about what it is that we hope for children when they reach, as it were, the top of that ladder, when they've kind of got past the start, when they've learned how to log on, when they've learned how to kind of manage some of the early, simpler sites and apps and services. Where should they go next? What does a great website look like? What's the online equivalent of the Secret Garden? What's the imaginative resource that we want children to engage with? What's a good game? Are our librarians advising on the good game, the good app, the good website, as they do advise on the good book? So I think my answers about what I hope to see at the top would again come from a kind of child rights perspective. I hope that as children get better and more experienced and more opportunities to go online, they will have more chance for creativity and expression and participation and sociability and autonomy. But I think we don't know how to get there. We don't know what are the steps. And I think I'm talking to a group of people who may have some really great ideas because you're the specialists in learning and in cultural expression and engagement and in managing systems of knowledge and information and of ensuring that children are enabled to engage with all of those opportunities. So I think the questions about what we hope for in the abstract, maybe they're straightforward, if we all agree, which I'm sure we don't. But how to get there, I really want us to think more about those steps. Because in the past couple of years, I've been visiting parents in their homes and visiting parents and asking them, okay, you're surrounded by all this technology, you've bought it, what did you hope for it, what are you doing with it? And they're saying, I'm really worried about how long they're spending on it. I'm really worried about how to keep it working, and is this a good game that they're playing, and what do I want my child to be doing? And I ask them, who do you turn to? How do you answer your questions? And then they say, well, I can't really turn to my parents because, you know, I turn to them for advice about food or sleep, but I can't turn to them for this. And sadly, they often say, I don't really feel I can turn to my child's teachers. They're very busy. I don't necessarily feel so welcome inside the school. My child doesn't tell me anything about what they're learning. What did you do today? Nothing. So that kind of, parents don't know where to go. And I'm hoping, again, that I'm talking to a bunch of people who have some ideas about what would be the great places to go online. But I think as a society, we're not discussing this because we're all talking about something else. So we are very focused on the risks and the fears about the digital world, and the headlines are absolutely full of all the things that are going wrong with those digital platforms. So we have some very anxious parents. We have an increasingly anxious society. Even some of the platforms are beginning to get anxious about the kind of Frankenstein's monster that they have unleashed on the world. And children are getting anxious. So now when I talk to children, I hear them say, oh, I'm worried, I think I'm online too long, I think I'm addicted, I'm not sure I can explore really because what will I find? I'm not sure I can experiment because I've been told that it's dangerous. So this resource that we built and began building with great excitement 30 years ago has become something that even now children are fearful of exploring and feeling excited about. And I don't say the risks are not real. Behind some of these stories, there are some tragedies. And behind some of the stories, there are children who are really struggling, and the online world is making things worse for them. But there's also a lot of hype, and there's also a lot of claims about harms, which research doesn't bear out to the same degree, but makes us very overprotective. So this is one of my favourite pictures of that I recently discovered. And it kind of reminds me of what we thought opportunities, and indeed risky opportunities, looked like perhaps in the days before health and safety, and the days before we had to make a risk assessment before we could let a child do anything. But I think we like this picture, right? I think we see happy children feeling that they are agents, you know, it brings out something nostalgic in all of us about what we think childhood could be. So the early days of the internet, it kind of looked like this. We were looking, we felt children did have those opportunities to kind of explore and engage in ways that for them were exciting and were child-centered spaces, but not very safe. It has to be said. You know, I can't take the health and safety kind of vision out of my head. And so we've become increasingly risk-averse in relation to the playground. And now we're becoming increasingly risk-averse in relation to the internet. And I want us to think a little bit about what we're losing if we really get so risk-averse that we constantly advise children, as we often do, that online they must be very good, they must be very dutiful, they must be proper citizens, they must take their responsibilities, even though they know they're in a world where adults are not behaving like that. But it's become a kind of struggle about good, dutiful behaviour. And we're entering a discourse, I think, in which we're talking more about regulating children, offline actually and online, than we are about children thriving, and I'll just say thriving online. And I think we're talking about regulating children online partly because we don't know how to regulate the online environment itself. But I think we're remembering our free childhood when we see an image like this. And every parent I interview, not every, many parents that I interview, tells me about that image of their own childhood when they could just open the door and run out and play, and parents didn't know where they were. A kind of image of freedom and autonomy. We remember that and we carry it around with ourselves when we look at our children on their smartphones, and we look at them with regret, I think. And we remember it rightly not because it was true, because not everyone did have a happy, free childhood in which nothing bad ever went wrong, actually, but because that experience, that sense of autonomy and agency is what children need to develop resilience, is what children need to become agents who can take responsibility for themselves. And somehow we've got to allow some measure of risk-taking and risky opportunities for children to become resilient and to thrive online. And that applies to all children, even the ones who are vulnerable. And often our desire to protect vulnerable children is the kind of killer argument for saying we have to lock down the internet, or better, we have to lock down children as they access the internet. So this is just one example of the kind of difficult social science findings that researchers and policymakers are now faced with. So this is from the Royal Society of Public Health. And they did a study on how children struggling with mental health difficulties and problems engage with the online world. And what they find is the ambivalence that we all feel about the internet. That in some ways that there is a growing problem of mental health difficulties among young people. The internet, the online world is part and parcel of that, and somehow kind of in some ways adding to it through problems like cyberbullying. But the internet is also the place where they get help and support, and they can find other people who can support them, whether it's other peers who kind of understand, or specialist sources of support. So in relation to the kids that we kind of most want to kind of wrap up and protect, we're often among the most, we risk taking them away from some of the opportunities and supports that they most really need. This is a picture of my local park, and I walk past this tree every day on my way to the tube, and I don't know if you can see, but high up in the tree there are some children climbing, and I'm not sure if that fits health and safety or not. But it's a different kind of model from the picture I showed you earlier, because the parents are at the bottom and they're having a chat, and they're not actually looking at the kids right now, but they'll hear if somebody cries. And it's a kind of model of, as it were, scaffolded freedom that I think we figured out offline and we haven't yet figured out online. And all of those apps that say, monitor your child, spy on your child, know everything your child does, is not the same as the kind of subtle caring that I would say the parents are doing here. We haven't figured out in the online world how to do some of the enabled and scaffolded freedoms that we can do and do in the offline world. And I don't think that that's because parents are lacking or children are lacking. I think it's something about the difference between the online world and the offline world as it is conceived, designed, regulated, managed. So I think of this as a kind of a poor analogy in a way, because the online world for sure is made up of the big platforms which dominate. But the offline world is not exactly the same, that a shop is like Amazon and that a park is like Facebook. It might be, these platforms might be displacing what children experienced offline or do experience offline. But offline, there are still also all kinds of norms, all kinds of ways in which adults can care, can guide, can provide. Other children can care and guide and provide for each other. And we've designed a very peculiar online world in which much of that is kind of difficult to manage. And I think that's where we are really struggling, but that's our new challenge. Now is a great moment to try to think, how can we redesign that digital world? So this is from my research with the EU Kids Online project, working with people across different European countries. We looked at how societies and parents are managing the balance between opportunities and risks, between allowing children to participate and protecting them. And all the dark purple countries are the countries where there is more protection than enabling. And the yellow and blue countries are where there is more doing not very much, just letting the kids kind of roam free. Might be good for them, might not. But the red countries I'm interested in, the Nordic countries and Northern European countries, where there is much more enabling in a kind of organised and thoughtful way, so that children are getting more benefits and they're becoming more resilient. So we have some, we can think as a society about the kind of balance we want in designing that digital world so that children can gain more opportunities and become more resilient and indeed thrive online. So I wanted to kind of think, what can we work towards? And I ask you, this is another of my favourite photos, and I ask you to take a second to think, what is this a photograph of? Because I think we've become very attuned to seeing this as a photograph of children staring at smartphones. And we've forgotten to see that this is also a photograph of children together, enjoying each other's presence, enjoying a moment together. Yes, sharing something on the phone, but absolutely as a social activity. And I want to ask you, as kind of my last thought really, what would we like to be on that phone? What do we hope they're looking at? What would stimulate them? Is it something imaginative? Could we identify that's something imaginative if it were? Is it something horrible? I don't think it's something horrible, but I'm not sure. Some of the parents I've been interviewing have been kind of finding the resources within their environment to kind of manage or scaffold or kind of provide different non-mainstream alternative opportunities for their children online. Not everyone is thinking about that. Many people have other worries in their lives. Not everyone is finding those opportunities. Not everyone is finding that kind of guidance, that conversation in the people around them to think about what might be on that child's phone. What I really hope your next move would be, if you saw those children, is not to say, put away your phone, you've been on it too long, but, oh, what are you looking at? Tell me about it. Can I join in that? Can I share that? Probably not, actually, but never hurts to ask. We need a discussion about what we want on that phone, what we want, how we can get engaged, and how we can listen to children in the process. And that really, I see that we're all ending with the Convention on the Rights of the Child, so I will too. What does the Convention on the Rights of the Child say? It says children are rights holders. They have the right to participate fully in society, not to be boxed off in a funny corner of the world. They have the right to engage with their privacy intact, with their rights to assembly, speech, and so forth. They have the right to be heard. And they have the right for us as the adults in society with the responsibilities but also the resources in managing all of our social and cultural and educational institutions. They have the right to expect us to be kind of thinking about these issues and kind of working to make that online space better and to ensure that children are in fact thriving online. Thank you very much.